Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got into the 4 albums and pitched into this big pot of music that I'm calling Tier 1. This is going to form the basis for all the music we're listening to throughout the entire year. I'm going to compare and contrast, and by the end of the year, I'm going to have a top 20 of 2024, and this is the very first step in that direction. So let's go ahead and get started. First one I got up is Death's Dynamic Shroud Transcendence Spot. Death's Dynamic Shroud is a curious beast, in my opinion. They started as a group of 3 guys that were just making online mixtapes and trading them with each other. And they were very prolific in this regard and started kind of finding an audience through online venues, not unlike part of the Vaporwave community. And eventually their work evolved into these fully rendered, proper studio albums. And while their output kind of has a lot of the hallmarks of Vaporwave, like kind of slowed down vocals and chopped up recording techniques, their full albums are way more layered and dynamic, I think, than the average Vaporwave album. Their Dark Life album shot to the top of my favorites in 2021 and ended up being a top 20 album. So I've kind of had my ear to the ground on their kind of confusing output, looking for the next thing to come out. Transcendence is a concept album that outlines a synthetic being's sort of pathway to sentience and eventually transcendence. And in some ways, it's kind of the perfect album for the AI generation. While the narrative is really only told in the most impressionistic way, it still comes off pretty clearly. The sort of affectations that Death's Dynamic Shroud has, because of their kind of Vaporwave background, allows this album to be set in a really intense, diverse musical environment, with elements of incredible beauty juxtaposed against like an almost intense abrasion at times. And a cybernetically psychedelic approach that has that kind of feeling of just kind of gently being not right in the same way that a lot of AI art is. The sort of unnatural, choppy vocal effects in particular kind of gives the impression of this consciousness clawing its way to existence over the course of the album. Now, Transcendence was originally conceived as part of Death Dynamic Shroud .wmv, their sort of mixtape incarnation in 2022. And as such, it kind of addresses our relationship with AI in some ways conceptually a little bit early, because that really wasn't something that started really coming up until 2023. But it feels very, very relevant right now. And Transcendence was released along with 2 other albums, Keys to the Gate and Midnight Tangerine, that were both kind of in the same boat. And you can bet your bottom dollar that both those albums are going to show up in the rotation of 2024. Okay, next up I got Madlib's Sound Ancestors. After DJ Shadow released Introducing in the mid-90s, I kind of did my best to find other albums in that vein, because that album was so influential and changed my perspective of what's possible in that style of music. And while this, Madlib's 2020 collaboration with Fortet, still doesn't quite capture the genius of that album, it still is one of the few that has kind of come close. Sound Ancestors was curated and arranged by Fortet out of hundreds of recordings that Madlib had sent him over the course of several years. And this collaboration to me really emphasizes what I find fascinating about this style of instrumental hip-hop is its seamlessness. And this is true with the DJ Shadow album too, where you have these samples that are coming from way different places, sometimes even different eras of musical recording, and they very often still carry the hallmarks of those periods. But they fit together in a way that's really seamless. And this is actually really pronounced, I think, on Sound Ancestors, because Madlib's preference is to use those samples in their original form. He doesn't really alter them in any way. He doesn't speed them up. He doesn't slow them down. The saxophone solo that you have on there pretty much is in the form that the saxophone solo originally occurred on the recordings that he pulled them from. And there's some fantastic bangers on Sound Ancestors, but these are also tempered by tracks that are a little bit more heady and meant as more listening experiences. Some of these, like the title track, are pretty heady. I mean, that track takes sort of wooden Indonesian gamelan sound and juxtaposes it with free jazz, and again makes it sound like one thing. It's not exactly toe-tapping stuff, but it doesn't have to be, especially in the hands of somebody with the kind of musical nuance that Madlib has. Okay, next up I got Polyphia's Remember That You Will Die. For many fans, Polyphia represents a next generation approach to shred guitar technique. In a very general sense, their style is relatively free of the obvious influence of Eddie Van Halen and Yngwie Malmsteen and those kinds of metal shred guys from the 80s and 90s. Instead, they lean very hard on the sort of thumb funk finger-picking technique that has been pioneered by Tosin Abasi and Animals as leaders. And I'm a guy with some familiarity with guitar technique, but I often find their playing as inscrutable as I find it thrilling. Now, on Remember That You Will Die, Polyphia kind of pushes prog metal into this very distinctive, jazzy, hip-hop influenced realms that, like Jacob Zytecki was getting into a couple years ago with his album Nothing Lasts, Nothing's Lost. In addition to this really angular guitar technique, drums are recorded with a very unnatural hip-hop crispness that accompanies sort of the glitchy melodic approach that the rest of the band is doing in an effective way. Now, unlike a lot of instrumental prog groups, Polyphia does make some attempt to make their music appealing to the listener. It's not so driven by the technique that it loses its musicality. And I think that this approach is one of their clear strengths, because anytime they try to walk out of that, they start to have some little bit of problems, I think, in this album. There's a few vocal collaborations in this album, I think, that actually, in particular, sort of suffer a little bit from just being a little bit, as Anthony Fantano, I believe, said, a little overcrowded. I think that's a fair assessment. For example, the track ABC, for all of its complexity, kind of comes off like a precocious undergrad jazz student's attempt to get under his jazz arranging class professor's skin. But the collaboration with Steve Vai is actually one of the high points of the album. Vai steps in like some sort of godfather of shred, like he's trying to pass the torch to these younger players. And although his style feels a little bit of its time, it's of that generation of shred, it's still impeccable and the top version of that style of playing. And I think it actually gives their music a little bit of a linearity that juxtaposes this very kind of angular, vertical approach that they have to their guitar playing. And finally, I got Devo's Q, Are We Not Men? A, We Are Devo. Now, potentially, there's a dissertation's worth of discussion you can do about Devo and their concept, and specifically the way that it dramatized conformity and emotional repression. But it is safe to say that in 1978, when they came out with this debut album, people pretty much didn't get what they were doing. Still, amongst those in the know, Devo had a lot of support, high-profile support in some cases. David Bowie, Robert Fripp, Iggy Pop all kind of vied to support and possibly even produce this album as their debut album. Now, ultimately, the job, though, went to Brian Eno. And even though this is pretty early in his stage in his career, Eno had definitely gained a reputation for himself as being a top-notch producer. And interestingly, despite Eno's growing fame and proclivity towards high-end production, members of Devo had gone on record as saying that they were pretty resistant to some of Eno's ideas because their belief in their concept was so confident and they defended it with all their might that sometimes the Eno suggestions were dismissed. And that might seem a bit arrogant and precocious for a band to do on their debut, but you got to respect the amount of dedication that they had to the concept they're trying to get across. Now, Devo is probably best remembered for their 1980 hit Whip It, which was really driven by synthesizers. But, especially at this stage in the career, Devo was not a synth band. Very clearly, this album is a guitar-driven album. The smattering of synths that they have in this album are mainly ornamental, and instead they lean on like chunky, angular guitars and robotic drums to sort of drive home this concept of dehumanization that they were trying to convey in their music. The most dramatic example I think of this you can find in the album is their deconstructed cover of the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction. The lurching and kind of comically robotic feel that song has pervades the album and really crowns Devo, I think, as the king of cork rock, putting him up against like the early XTC and the Talking Heads that were sort of their contemporaries at the time. That's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, like and subscribe and share it out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. All these tracks are going up in a big playlist. You can go and check it out. And if you want to be part of my Viewer's Choice playlist, we're going to be starting the showdowns pretty soon. Please sign up for my Patreon below. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.